networking and information sharing framework that we all recognize is important and really want as we move forward. So our roadmap today in terms of our agenda, which participants would have received last week via email, has two major components, both built around the goal of the webinar being an information sharing event. The first section will cover key decisions and actions that have occurred since March 2016 in the development of the conservation team. This information includes work on how the conservation team, when fully built out, will be structured, the role and responsibilities of the steering committee. You'll also hear how the recommendations of the recovery team have informed discussion and aided in setting priorities and tasks for the conservation team. And at various points, you'll hear about how you can get involved in what's in store for everyone getting back together in 2017. The second major component of our webinar will provide updates, key developments for the species. So those things like census results, cowbird tracking and monitoring updates, and a piece on potential downlisting work for the species. We're excited about this component because it really provides timely communication of management-related work and also maintains that continuity in getting information to all of us who are actively involved in the conservation effort and just want to be informed on what's happening with the species. We'll also have two question and answer segments where you can write questions into the chat feature of the GoToMeeting webinar platform. And if you haven't found that yet, it's located on the right-hand side of your screen. And these are questions for the Conservation Team Steering Committee or any partners who are presenting in the webinar. So using that chat function as a way to launch into a few housekeeping items so that you can have the best experience possible during the webinar and certainly navigate those functions when if you have called into this webinar and are on the phone, please mute your computer speakers. I had mentioned earlier that helps reduce feedback and echoing. And if you are not a presenter, you can hang up and listen in listen-only mode and use that chat function as your way of communication. So that is going to be our main method of communication. Please use this during the question and answer sections. And also if you're experiencing any kind of technical difficulty. We have two folks kind of our eyes on the chat box, and they'll get information to the right person if you're having an issue. And we're also collecting all questions and feedback and input along the way. So definitely use that chat box to be connected to us throughout this presentation. And I think maybe we'll just do a quick that everybody's finding the chat box. And so if you could just take a minute and type in the answer to the following question: what is your favorite thing about fall? Just to make sure that folks are finding it and know where it is. He's just watching that here next to me, and I know Bill and David are also watching. It seems like we have activity, and folks are finding where that chat box is. The last housekeeping item is that we are recording the webinar today, so if you know of people who weren't able to participate, that link will be made available for folks to download and view at another time. And will be sent out to folks in a communication following the webinar today. Next slide. Here's a list of today's presenters in order of appearance for everyone to take a look at. In developing the webinar, we wanted to provide an opportunity for a vast majority of steering committee members to be involved, so that listening, you can become better acquainted with those individuals in their role. We also wanted to provide those updates and key developments, so we have a few partners joining us today. So now you have an idea. Let's hear what they have to say. And I'm actually going to keep talking because I'm the first presenter. Just a quick note on how we got to where we are today to kind of set the stage for what we'll be talking about in terms of conservation team development. So in 2011, with the signing of the Interagency Memorandum of Understanding, there was a signaling that transition from recovery to conservation forever for the species was occurring. Things like the breeding range conservation plan was being developed and the alliance was forming to add value to outreach activities and fill roles that were important for the species moving forward. As a result of this start into transition, we had a collaborative process that was born where voting members of the recovery team and alliance directors met always in conjunction with recovery team meetings to discuss what the future of information sharing, partnership building, and collaboration would look like. Certainly the intent of that collaboration was to focus on building a public-private partner network that would steward the 40 years of success and then catalyze and foster new opportunities to work across all associated habitats of Kirtland's warbler. These discussions also identified some key changes that are worth noting in the transition that the conservation team will use to guide their structure and how interactions of that team will occur and set priorities. And these key changes are really that the conservation team will be self-governing. Not one entity or organization will mandate that they meet and discuss and collaborate. Now feel that we're working under a philosophy of long-term sustainability or conservation forever for Kirtland's warbler rather than a philosophy of recovery. And that sort of just changes the discussion a little bit, changes sort of the outlook a little bit. Certainly full life cycle is being elevated and more intentional in discussions. And there is a funding component that we're all collectively tackling and talking about as we move forward. So all of this discussion led to the decision to have the Kirtland's warbler recovery team make a formal transition to the conservation team in the event that, in the way that the recovery team will now exist on paper, rather being the operational arm of conservation and collaboration. They can be called together if need be by the species. And the conservation team is now stepping into that role of the main coordinator, collaborator, and bringing together of people in the conservation community. And one final note, in making a transition like this, moving from form and function that's 40 years in the making, that can take quite a bit of time and effort to sort of work through all of the nuances and all of the details. And so, you know, the group will operate under those key changes that we just talked about. And because an initial dedication of extra time and energy was going to be needed, a small group was assembled representing a broad range of expertise to move through decisions using their experience and meet that goal of being operational by March of 2017. So I'll say, you know, from my standpoint, and I think I speak for the folks who have been working for the last little while, that we're really excited to be at this point where a number of details can be shared. You know, we've worked through some key discussions, and we're really excited to be reaching out and bringing folks in and plugging them in to engage more as we move forward. So with that, Keith, I'll go to the next slide. And with that bit of background and orientation, I want to jump in and hand this off to the great presenters that we have today, and I'll welcome Katie Cook to talk a bit more about the steering committee and their role.
Thank you so much, Abby. Keith, can you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So as Abby said, we started with a smaller initial steering committee, and we met very frequently and have been working really, really hard to develop the structure and develop a charter document and really think through the nuances of Kirtland's warbler conservation looking forward. So what you see in this picture is the initial steering committee that gathered on March 31st of 2016. We went through a really good visioning session at that meeting and have since really been focusing on structure, and we're all excited, as Abby said, we're all excited to be at this point and ready to move from planning to action. So we finalized our charter just this Monday, and as part of the charter we identified several elements. And so the first one is you know, steering committee composition. And so what we've decided is that at any given time we want to have 15 to 20 members on our steering committee who are representative of in the larger Kirtland's warbler community. So our initial steering committee, what we did is we sent a request, the recovery team sent a request out to several agencies and organizations asking for them to self-nominate a representative. So right now our steering committee includes representatives from Michigan DNR, Wisconsin DNR, U.S. Forest Service, and that's 3 national forests, the Huron-Manistee, the Hiawatha, and the Chequamegon-Nicolet. the USDA Wildlife Services, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, specifically the Refuges and Migratory Birds Program, Environment Canada, the Nature Conservancy, California University of Pennsylvania, Huron Pines, the Kirtland Warbler Alliance, and the Bahamas National Trust. And so that's gives you a sense of what organizations have been involved in stepping up this new steering committee and the new structure for the conservation team. And as Abby said, we also have a chair, and she's graciously stepped into the chair position. And this committee is a volunteer position that rotates every couple of years and is recruited from and voted upon by the steering committee. Next slide, please. And so this first paragraph really is the purpose of our steering committee. So we're really trying to provide continuity for Kirtland's warbler conservation by preserving knowledge and serving as a resource collective as we grow the new Kirtland's warbler conservation team. Next slide, please. And as Abby said, this has been our initial charge. We've really been working fast and furious to create the necessary structure for the conservation team to become fully operational in March of next year. And we're right on track with that, as you'll see on our next slide. So these first three bullets are, in developing our charter and thinking through the role of the steering committee and how we relate to other aspects of the conservation team as it builds out, we really try to be very specific about our purpose and roles. And purpose is captured in these three bullets, right? Ensuring communication, helping to provide some governance and identifying priorities, membership, operational procedures, and also checking in, just like we're doing today, to get feedback from the broader Kirtland's Warbler conservation team at key decision points. But also on this slide, I've included some other tasks or roles of the steering committee. So we're looking always to expand partnerships, collaborating to seek funding for priority conservation actions, making sure that we support and integrate the various subcommittee activities that you're going to hear about very shortly, tracking our accomplishments, communicating our successes, and ultimately sustaining broad constituency, broad public support for the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team mission.
All right, thank you, Katie. In March, we had a number of recommendations provided by the recovery team to help inform development of the conservation team. Here to talk a little bit more about how those have been brought into discussion is Steve Sjogren.
Thank you, Abby. Next slide, Keith. So I just would like to take a few minutes here to provide a really brief overview of how we can incorporate the recovery team recommendations and use them to guide the initial setup and functioning of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, which, as we've heard, is replacing the recovery team. Slide, please. One of the last tasks the Kirtland's Warbler Recovery Team completed was to create a list of recommendations that could help launch a new era for KW under the newly established conservation team. There were many, many years of accumulated KW research, management, and outreach experience in the room at that final recovery team meeting last March. A bulleted listing of over 50 recommendations were developed by the recovery team and handed over to the conservation team. Then the following day, the conservation team steering committee identified a work group to prioritize the recommendations and create action items. And you can see the work group members that are listed there that did this task. And so this work group met over the summer to organize the recommendations. They were organized around the proposed conservation team subcommittee structure that will be covered in a little bit more detail by Sarah and others in a couple of minutes. But they're basically the steering committee plus the new breeding season, non-breeding season, and human dimensions subcommittee. So next slide, please. So we don't have enough time to go over all of the recommendations provided by the recovery team. My contact information is there. If you'd like a copy of this spreadsheet that lists all of the prioritized recommendations and proposed action items, just send me an email. You can get a copy. Priority 1 included things like administrative and membership considerations needed for the conservation team startup and transition from the recovery team, which basically is during this first 6 months of operation. Priority 2 were tasks that we would start working on immediately as the various subcommittees are up and running, and ideally this would begin within the first year. And then priority 3 were those things. So go ahead, slide, please. Instead of going over the entire spreadsheet, I have a few examples of some of the higher priority recommendations and action items from the recovery team. So for example, for the breeding season, recommendations included developing a more consistent and efficient census method across the entire breeding range. Managers and researchers should collaborate to set up adaptive management objectives, indicators, and either monitoring or research to better inform management decisions. We should work to improve the KW breeding distribution across the range. We should be working on creating and evaluating experimental habitat that will reduce costs, but also increase biodiversity and marketability while sustaining KW numbers. And there are questions still to be answered about the Cowbird program. And then the next box there for the non-breeding season, work is needed to complete the winter range assessment that is currently underway, and then begin work on a migration and winter season conservation plan similar to the one that was completed for the breeding range about a year ago. Next slide. There were many recommendations from the recovery team concerning research and monitoring. Going to be to build both research and management skills into each conservation team subcommittee. Research skills will be needed not only to conduct research, but also to review new research proposals and make recommendations, help implement adaptive management, update lists of the most important research and monitoring questions, and maintain a comprehensive Kirtland's Warbler publication list. Human dimensions was recognized as an area that could use focus in the future. It will be important to develop a communication and outreach plan using marketing and community involvement skills. That's just a quick overview of some of the priority recommendations the recovery team provided to the conservation team and really to all of our Kirtland's Warbler partners to help facilitate this transition from recovery to sustainable long-term conservation of KW. Thank you.
All right, great, Steve. Thank you so much. The recovery team recommendations have been a great guidepost for thinking about the future work of the conservation team. And have certainly helped direct a lot of work to date, some of which has been the formal structure of the conservation team and its operations. Sarah Sikorsky led that work and will tell you a bit more about the development.
Thank you, Abby. This is Sarah. Go ahead and please advance the slide. So we're coming up with the new subcommittees that would be part of the conservation team. And in order to do that, the first thing we did was identify the purpose of the subcommittees, which we had consensus was to align with the conservation team and have the expertise and coordination and move forward the conservation team priorities. So to determine the number of subcommittees and their unique functional role, we considered the 15 core elements that we identified in our spring meetings. And then we also incorporated the 4 conservation team priorities and the breeding range conservation plan goals and deliverables. I listed those up on there. I'm not going to read through those, but if you do look, you'll see there's some overlap among some of those different elements. Lumping and splitting was done with consideration given to the distribution of expertise and the distribution of the elements. We, in the end, did more grouping than splitting to retain this holistic approach and ensure that several of the different elements are integrated into all the work that we do. And then as Steve mentioned, we coordinated with his working group so that we can ensure a smooth transition by incorporating the recovery team recommendations clearly to task the subcommittees. Next slide, please. And in the end, we came up with the 3 subcommittees, the non-breeding season conservation subcommittee, the breeding season conservation subcommittee, and the human dimensions or capacity building subcommittee. The third kind of last step of that development of the subcommittees was to identify who's going to be on them and how do we go about forming the membership. And so in order to keep things moving along, there was consensus to identify leads of people who we knew from our previous work with Kirtland Warblers that would be interested in perhaps taking on the responsibility for continuing organizing and coordinating these subcommittees and move to action, recruit membership and people to be part of these subcommittee working groups. And so they will be looking for volunteers and also maybe recruiting folks to make sure they have the proper expertise on their subcommittee groups. Next slide. And then lastly, this is just a visual representation for those visual learners out there of our conservation team structure. We have the steering committee, and now we have these 3 subcommittees. And together we will be communicating with the greater conservation community. And that's all I have. Next slide.
Okay, awesome, Sarah. Thanks so much for that. And it was a great overview of sort of this whole conservation team structure that we're striving towards. And with people plugging in and becoming more engaged, we're going to see that structure become more robust and filled with more folks. So to talk a little bit, which is definitely an area where folks can begin to plug in. You're going to hear from those 3 leads for each committee, and first up we have Keith Kintai, who is leading the breeding range subcommittee.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Steve alluded to a little bit, the breeding range subcommittee has been charged with working on 5 important topics. Those are reiterated here. I'll just go into them a little bit. This is a lot of these topics were, based on recommendations from the recovery team, represented ongoing and important work, and also represent important conservation objectives that have been identified in various planning processes over the last couple years. Related to monitoring and evaluation, an important continuing project we have is improving monitoring relating to census, as Steve mentioned. In terms of improving the breeding distribution, this is a goal directly from the at the core Wisconsin and Canada. This is really including very explicit discussions about trap duration, seasonality, and trapping densities. The 4th topic here, improving marketability and biodiversity considerations, also a very long ongoing conversation where improvements have been made, but a lot of work continues or needs to continue to be done. And there are a number of ongoing research projects related to this, including Dr. Rothstein's Jack Pine marketability research from Michigan State University. And then lastly, just this notion of expanding partnerships and the need for identifying additional collaboration opportunity to strengthen our work. So these are a broad and ambitious set of topics, obviously. This subcommittee will initially need to spend some time on how we resource work towards these topics. I hope to get, many folks have contacted me about participation in the subcommittee, and I hope to get a more formal invitation out this week with the goal of having a first meeting in late November or early December. So if you'd like to talk to me explicitly about this, you see my email contact info there at the bottom.
Okay, and I guess now we'll move sort of like Kirtland's Warblers have been doing of late from the breeding range to the non-breeding range. So Dave Ewart, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you, Abby. If I could have the next slide, Keith. Thanks. So the non-breeding subcommittee has really one principal role, and that is to develop and then, most importantly, implement a non-breeding season conservation plan. This plan will consist of a review of what we know about the non-breeding season and then have recommendations on what we think can or should be done to maintain Kirtland's warblers outside the breeding season. So to do this, we'll have to coordinate research across both breeding and non-breeding seasons given the carryover effects that take place. And this will also then require close coordination with the other subcommittees to recognize that important carryover consequence. So far we have members of this committee that include Carol Bassetti, Nathan Cooper, myself, Phil Huber, and then we'll have a representative from Bahamas National Trust as well. So these members represent expertise from different points of the life cycle of the Kirtland warblers to better ensure that we have this coordination. Next slide, Keith. So with the non-breeding subcommittee, I'll just give you some examples of potential topics that we'll be working on. One will be the management guidance. There's a lot we don't know yet, so some of the the guidance will be tentative. So we'll make sure that we're clear on what we are more confident in knowing and what we're not. Well, suggestions for implementation that we feel more confident about, such as rights-of-way management under utility power lines in the Bahamas. The reason for that is that these power lines, of course, run throughout the country, so we can operate at scale with that kind of management. There are lots of important information gaps that need to be filled. Nathan will talk a bit about some of that in terms of migration, but also on the non-breeding season in the winter, and we'll be articulating those research needs and also prioritizing those research needs. It's also important that we institutionalize the Kirtland warbler work in the Bahamas and along the migration route. So again, as we become more refined in our knowledge and our ability to make recommendations, we'll know better who to bring into the process to ensure this whole life cycle protection does take place. And to do this also requires, obviously, that we integrate throughout the life cycle. So this is built right into the membership of the subcommittee. And if you have any other questions, you can contact me. The contact information is there. That's it.
All right, thank you, Dave. And I know we're certainly looking forward to the work that comes out of that non-breeding range subcommittee. The third priority subcommittee that's been identified has been called Human Dimensions. The lead for this committee is Brad Jensen, who's the executive director here at Huron Pines. He unfortunately could not be with us today, so I will provide the update in his absence. So Keith, if you could advance the slide. So why work with humans? This is an area that I think that more folks involved in conservation are spending time thinking about and working to identify how conservation activities and land management can be more strongly connected to local communities and populations. I think historically we've seen pushback to management decisions, lack of local buy-in, perceived use conflicts, and a general lack of understanding as to why certain management decisions are being made. If you then couple that with some current social trends we're seeing, like increased and varying uses of public lands, less engagement with natural resources or even just getting outdoors, and then a for it or against it approach to conflict, you can start to see that there's huge potential and for real impact on Kirtland's warbler and jack pine management. So if we don't work with humans and get a better sense of how to engage audiences, both new and existing, with the species and its habitat and the work that we're doing, we could run the risk of that not being relevant. So through the avenue of human dimensions and through the work of the conservation team, we can start to study and understand the social attitude of the folks that we're trying to engage and the folks in local communities, and learn how those relate to maintaining, protecting, and enhancing natural resources like the Kirtland warbler and the jack pine habitat. So this is really an area and an opportunity for the conservation team to take hold of and start to get their arms around. It's a pretty big topic, and I think we all recognize that, and it needs a lot of discussion. But here's where the subcommittee has sort of started their work and some next steps. So a guiding document outlining a variety of audiences for Kirtland's warbler management was developed and discussed at a steering committee meeting late this summer. Some of the examples of audiences that were included in that are the conservation community, like the folks of us here on phone, birders, legislators, local decision makers, frontline responders, so thinking about firemen, policemen, health officials, outdoor rec users, and school children, just to name a few. There were plenty more than that. Through discussion in August, that list was initially prioritized, and 4 audiences kind of were identified as priority. And those were sort of the K-12 school children audience, economic development, community development folks, certainly reaching out and starting to engage those leaders in our communities, decision makers, local government decision makers, state legislators, and then potential funders or project partner supporters, all identified as key. So where we go from there is that list will be sort of further refined by the subcommittee, and then we hope to conduct some interviews with outside partners who have an expertise in engaging stakeholders and mapping communication pathways. So these are folks who are not necessarily involved day-to-day in natural resource management, but they certainly have expertise and work with this engaging people and understanding messaging and how to reach people to have impact. And then all of that information will be gathered, and the goal is to present a draft outreach and community engagement plan in March of 2017. So that's sort of where we are right now with it. We do have a small committee that has been put together with a few folks: Kim Piccolo, Bill Rapay, Brad Jensen, myself, and Katie Cook. Our point, and I think this is a really interesting topic. I think it's of interest to a lot of folks. So if you want to learn more or get more involved, Brad's contact information is there on the screen. And we certainly can use lots of perspectives to kind of understand who's out there and how we should be engaging them. So with that, we're going to wrap up information on the subcommittees, and a big thanks to the leads for providing that information. These folks are all excited to start building their committees and getting work going. There's been a lot of planning, as Katie mentioned earlier, so it's great to get to the action. So again, please contact Dave, Keith, or Brad if you have questions or want more information. So I just mentioned March of 2017 as a goal for some of the work of the Human Dimensions Subcommittee, and I know that's a target for other folks developing committees, which leads me to talk about what's happening in March of 2017. So we'd like everyone to mark their calendars for March 15th, 2017, when the conservation team will be hosting a Kirtland's Warbler conservation conference or workshop. This is something that we're really excited about, and again, it's a way to get us all back together, to get us all networking and sharing information and plugging in. I will say that as of today, plans are still very much more to come on this. But very loosely, this event will be a one-day conference-style or workshop-style event where the conservation community can come, network, share information, attend sessions or roundtable-type work sessions on issues related to Kirtland's Warbler conservation. It's also the target for the conservation team to be fully operational, so an event like this is great for sharing plans, decisions, and what's next for collaboration and coordination for the species. So we don't have a location yet, and I'd ask if there are people out there on this webinar who have ideas on where a good location would be to please share those. You can type it into the chat box if you want, or get in touch with me at a later date. And certainly pulling something like this together takes many hands and many perspectives, so if there are folks who want to help design and develop this event, we'd welcome that engagement as well. So next slide, please. So great, so we are already to our first question and answer session, just to orient you to your agenda. So it's item E, just before the 2:30 update section. So we're going to give you some time to type some questions into the chat box. And Bill Rapay is going to moderate for us, and how this is going to work is he's been capturing some of your questions. He'll read the ones that are coming in now and direct those questions to the appropriate presenter or steering committee member to respond. I will say that we might not get to everybody's questions, but we're certainly capturing them, and we'll answer them in some sort of follow-up communication from this webinar. So Bill, with that, I'm going to hand it to you, and you know, we've probably got 10 or 15 minutes or so to work through some questions. We've got time.
It does not appear, Katie, that there are any questions right now. I've been monitoring the chat box, and no one has any questions, so we must be really, really good at what we're doing.
Tom Cooper is requesting to be unmuted.
Yep, I'm doing that right now.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can. If you do you have your computer speakers on? If you could mute those, that would be helpful.
They're muted.
Okay, we can hear you.
You're the feedback echo guy on this call.
Yeah, just go ahead and cancel me and mute me again because my speakers are muted.
Huh.
Okay.
Hey, Tom, if you want to send me your comments, I can share them for you.
I will do that.
Okay. Sorry, Tom. We had this problem with so many people on Monday, so please don't feel bad. It's a glitchy system.
Okay, so Katie is going to field the question from Tom Cooper, which that's great. If there are other questions out there, please feel free to type them into your chat function, and we'll get to them.
Looks like we have a question from Tom Will. Are you able to see that, Bill?
Yes, I am. The question from Tom Will says, at the bottom of the slide listing the 3 subcommittees, there was a list of folks in a working group, I believe. What group is that? How is that different from the steering committee?
Do you want me to answer that, or would you like Sarah to take that?
Let's ask Sarah to take that.
Sarah, are you there? Are you muted?
Abby, maybe you should take it.
Yeah, I think I'll just hop right in here. Yeah, so to answer your question, Tom, the working group, the list that you saw at the bottom of that slide, were a few members of the steering committee who were pulled together to work through sort of identifying what that built-out structure might look like and what the so they were members of the steering committee, but it was just a few people to kind of work through the details of that rather than the 18 or so folks who are steering committee members. And I will say that that work group has since dissolved, and now we're working through the subcommittees.
Abby, may I jump in with, I've got Tom Cooper's comments, and if now's a good time, I want to share those.
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, thanks. So Tom Cooper is the chief of the Midwest Regional Migratory Bird Program for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and here's what Tom has to say. I just want to thank everyone for their time and effort for transitioning from recovery team to the conservation team. Tom says he really likes the committee and steering committee structure, and it's great to see a mix of federal, state, and NGO partners stepping up to ensure the future viability of Kirtland's warblers. So thank you very much for that feedback, Tom.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate that very much. Any other questions or comments out there?
I don't see any additional questions in the chat. Oh, Dr. Cooper asks, will future research projects be expected to approach the conservation team either formally or informally to get approval, or will agencies handle such requests? Keith, do you think you could handle that one?
Yeah. My observation and participating in the recovery team over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years or so is that the primary role of the recovery team, and vetting is not even the right word, but in taking on research proposals is to act as you know, a feedback mechanism for and a collaboration mechanism. And so I think there would probably still be a lot of value from a research perspective to approach the conservation team for those sorts of things. But for practical purposes, the research that's been conducted on state and federal land, really probably you only need agency approval, you know, for land use permits and research permits and those sorts of things. But I think it would behoove the researchers to still be involved with the conservation team to take advantage of all of that wisdom that's there.
Right, and just to piggyback on that, this is Abby Ertel. You know, one of the recommendations that came through loud and clear from the recovery team was to integrate research a little bit more intentionally into, you know, these subcommittees and how they're coming together. So the idea is that, you know, we'll have some connection to the research community, and that, you know, some of this is still going to be figured out, but, you know, so that we can have discussion about maybe what research priorities are out there, what research is being sort of developed or wants to move forward, and some of that discussion is already happening in the subcommittee structure of the conservation team. But I will, you know, I'll agree with Keith, the decision and the oversight on what happens on state and federal lands for sure.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Abby. Not seeing any additional questions, we'll move on. But I'd just like to remind everybody there will be a second question and answer session at the end. So if something comes up that you know, think back on the first section, you can feel free to ask it again later.
And Phil just added to, related to Nathan's last question. He just to provide a reminder again, representing that institutional wisdom. Thanks, Phil. That the KW recovery team discussed proposals and voted on them and made recommendations to two researchers. And so I think that was part of Abby's point, is that within the subcommittees there'll still be an effort to prioritize research activities, recommended research activities from the conservation team and the subcommittee's perspective. I don't know if Phil wants to add any more to that. I wouldn't want to let that go. If Phil, I could unmute you if there's more you want to add on that. Okay, Phil's happy. I'm happy.
All right, sounds good. So next slide, please, Keith. So I guess wrapping up this first question and answer session, we'll move on to our next session of the agenda, which is that key updates piece for Kirtland's Warbler conservation in 2016. Those updates that we're going to talk about are captured on your screen right now in terms of census results, updates on Cowbird Management, and delisting work for downlisting, excuse me, work for the species. So next slide, please. To start us off, we will have Kim Piccolo cover census results.
Thanks, Abby. Next slide. Okay, so consolidation of census results in 2016, starting with the Michigan DNR in the Lower Peninsula. They didn't conduct a full census, but they spot checked new areas for presence-absence. Currently, they're not conducting the census in even years, just looking at odd years. And then this year, the DNR is working with Michigan State University to develop a monitoring protocol that will detect 20% change in the population. But no one has started that on the ground yet. For UP Michigan, there were 53 singing males, which was an increase from previous years, likely due to new young habitat that was available. Next. In Wisconsin, they surveyed 54 stands in 6 different counties and detected 30 singing males. And you can see in the middle of the state there in Adams County, there was a geographic expansion within that county, and the number of birds increased this year. And also there was expansion to more northern counties in Wisconsin. Next. On the Huron-Manistee National Forest in the Lower Peninsula, we had 1,074 singing males, which was a slight increase from last year. A few notable things was the Meridian fire, which burned in 2010. About 8,000 acres. We're expecting about 3,000 acres of KW habitat out of that, and we already had 8 singing males in there, so only 6 years after the fire. And trees are pretty young in there. Some people might be surprised that there's birds in there already. And then another notable thing is the Hughes Lake fire, which was from 2006 and falls within the Big Creek KWMA. It's at its peak right now, so we're expecting declines in the next few years. Next.
Okay, thank you, Kim. Another big piece to update folks on is the work on the Cowbird Management front. And we actually have a 2-part update for you on that today. And we'll start with Pat Ryan with USDA Wildlife Services.
Hello, everyone. This is Pat Ryan. I have an update from the field for you, Cowbird Trapping Program. This program has been around a long time now, from 1972 until present, so about 40 years. This program continues on or exists because cowbirds are a nest parasite and can potentially impact 48 to 86% of the KW nest, and that's a lot. Looking at the slide there, the typical example of a cowbird trap, we maintain 12 decoy birds, 12 banded birds in those traps, and provide food and water. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. So basically, here's where the traps were located last year. They're stretched out over a large geographical area, including 10 counties. We maintained 39 traps for 11 weeks. So basically, the end of April until the end of June, we hired 4 employees that ran 3 trap lines. The 4th trapper works the days off of each line to ensure maximum coverage of the traps. So there's 4 trucks in service, and they travel approximately 44,000 miles, and we removed 981 cowbirds last year. Next slide. So here's the historical trend, stuff you guys have seen before. And from 1972 to 2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service managed the trapping program. In 2015, the USDA signed a cooperative service agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So now USDA Wildlife Services manages the cowbird trapping program. But in saying that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife still owns the trucks, and they assist the trapping program with stuff like trap placement. So there's been a continuing decline in the catch rate in the recent past, as you see there to the far right on the slide. And there are less traps in the field, but it's evident that there are just fewer cowbirds on the landscape now. Last year we removed 981 birds, which is about 200 birds less than last year, and 400 birds less than the year before that. So, looking to the future, we are going to might try some smaller diameter wire, the wire that encompasses the trap, to reduce predation of our decoy birds and reduce missing birds. In 2016, we lost 150 decoy birds. In 2015, 260 decoy birds were lost. So our traps are kind of leaky. We're going to tighten that up a little bit, I hope. And also with the fire, we have a lot of problems with rodents, 13-line ground squirrels that kind of eat all the seed that we put out on the ground, and it makes our traps less effective for the free-ranging cowbirds. They identify the traps, and that seed helps get them in the trap along with the singing males. And something we'll talk about in the future with the Kirtland Warbler conservation team, stuff like shortening the trapping season. Currently, we start trapping prior to the of the Kirtland warblers, and then we trap after the bulk of the warblers have fledged. So those are some of the things we're looking at for the future there with the program. But all in all, the 2016 season was pretty smooth. Didn't have any problems with the public damaging the traps, You only had one area where a bear was turning up some traps. So, yeah, the season ran pretty good in 2016. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Pat, for that. And for the second part of this update, I'm going to pass it over to Nathan Cooper to provide some information on the research he's been doing in the realm of Cowbird Management as well.
All right, thanks. Next slide, Keith. So we just got a good overview of what happened in 2016. Pat mentioned we've been trapping cowbirds now for about 44 years. Parasitism rate has gone down roughly 70% back in 1971 to now well below 1%. And so this shows us that the overall program is quite successful, but as we all know, it's also fairly expensive, costs around $100,000, $110,000 per year. So a few years ago, we decided that it was time for a reevaluation. And basically, until present time, the effective range of a cowbird trap has assumed to be about a mile. We know this works, but it's a largely untested assumption. We know that brown-headed cowbirds move quite long distances across the landscape, potentially moving up to 15 kilometers or more within a day. And so it might be that the effective range of these traps is actually much larger. So let's design an experiment to simply test these two questions. First, what is the effective range of a cowbird? And then second, what sort of parasitism rate might Kirtland's warblers be able to withstand? Next slide, Keith. So our experimental design was fairly simple. We closed 12 traps in 2015 and 2016, and we plan to do so again in 2017. And we close these traps in such a way to create a trap distance gradient. And simply means that there's nesting Kirtland's warblers as close as 1 kilometer to the nearest trap, all the way out to 15 kilometers from the nearest active trap. And then we sought to monitor nests along this trap distance gradient for evidence of parasitism. The results so far have been somewhat surprising. In 2015, we only had 1 nest parasitized, and the egg was actually infertile. In 2016, we had 2 nests parasitized that were within a few hundred meters of each other, so potentially the same female cowbird parasitized both, and none of the Kirtlands survived from that nest. So certainly a bit of a surprise. I think everybody expected a larger response by the cowbird community, but given the what appear to be regional declines in cowbirds, perhaps makes a bit more sense. Next slide. So plans for the future. Final field season of this particular experiment. Once that season wraps up, we want to work with some of the population modelers and look at how potential changes in trapping might affect the population. And then we want to meet with the agency partners and the conservation team to start to work towards developing new protocols for brown-headed cowbird trapping. And then once those changes have been implemented, we plan to continue monitoring the parasitism rate to make sure that what we think is happening is actually happening, and that parasitism rates remain low enough for the population to be sustainable in the long term. And that's all I've got. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I think we're all looking forward to hearing more from you on your research and what that means for upcoming management decisions. Our next presenter is Scott Hicks, and he's here to share some information on work that is just starting with respect to a downlisting package for Kirtland's Warbler.
Great. Thank you, Abby. So next slide, please. So just to give folks an update on kind of what our plans are related to the listing of the Kirtland's Warbler under the Endangered Species Act. Back in August of 2012, we had our 5-year review for the species and identified that at that time the species no longer met the definition of an endangered species, but actually met the definition of a threatened species. And the definition of an endangered species is a species that's in danger of extinction presently, versus a threatened species is a species that is likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So as you guys have known for some time, your hard work and efforts have paid off, and many of the threats to the species have been addressed and the status has improved. And so as a result of that work, it no longer meets the definition of endangered species. So we plan to propose changing the status of the species from endangered to threatened. Next slide, please. And when we tell people that, generally they ask two different questions. The first question is, why not delisting? And it's a good question. You know, many of you know that the population goals have been met for many, many years now. There's been a lot of great work completed by many of you on the phone today, the conservation plan, the MOU, the conservation team, the initiative, the alliance. Many, many great efforts have gone on over the years, and the species is definitely headed in the right direction. But there's really two things that I think that kind of stand out, and maybe a few other questions that we'll need to think through as time goes on. But two main questions kind of stand out as far as why not delisting, and one of those is the long-term funding needs for the species. As we heard earlier, the Cowbird Management for the species is quite expensive, at least as currently implemented, and that is currently paid for by endangered species recovery dollars that are appropriated by Congress to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So if the species were no longer listed, we would need another funding source to cover that. So that's one piece of the puzzle, and we've been working on with our partners, the DNR and others, to come up with a different funding mechanism, and we've made progress on that. We still have some ways to go, and that's an important part of the work of the initiative and the alliance, is to help secure that long-term funding needs. And then the other question that comes up quite often is, what about climate change and response planning? And that's the subject of some additional research that's been going on by folks on the phone. And so that's another thing that we're getting more and more information on that'll help inform that question. But those are two main things that kind of stand out about why not delisting, why aren't we ready to yet. Next slide, please, Keith. And so then the next question that comes up is, why downlisting? And you know, if it's still going to remain listed, why bother going through the process of just changing the status from endangered to threatened? And I think there's a couple of important reasons, and probably the most important one is just documenting a success for the Endangered Species Act. I mean, we've already celebrated the transition from the recovery team to the conservation team, and we've helped mark some of these milestones along the way, and a downlisting is just another way of highlighting an important success of the Endangered Species Act and the success that you all have contributed to in recovery of the species. It also gives us the opportunity to kind of lay out the analysis of what we think the status of the species is, how the threats are potentially affecting the species, and how we foresee that we've addressed those threats or are addressing those threats. It provides the public with an additional opportunity for input and peer review. And then finally, it gives us another basis for a foundation for our next 5-year review, as well as once we have a couple more boxes checked, it can help facilitate the delisting process when we get. Next slide, please, Keith. So just a quick overview of the downlisting process. So the process works through a proposed rulemaking through the Federal Register. We would publish a proposed downlisting rule. That rule would go out for public comment for a 60-day public comment period. We would also go out and seek peer review on our proposed rule. And then after we've had the public comment period, the peer review feedback, we would evaluate that information and we would make a final determination. And that final determination could really take two different forms. It could either be a final rule, which would change the status of the species from endangered to threatened, or we could withdraw the proposed rule and stay at endangered. And that is kind of the downlisting process. Next slide, please. Just wanted to highlight a couple of things that, emphasis areas for us as we think about downlisting and delisting. We're continuing to support and look to improve our understanding of migration and wintering needs. Folks have heard about the geolocator project that Nathan led and has worked on, and we're working on trying to develop an additional study with Nathan to improve, again, our understanding of migration of the species and stopover sites. And partners on the phone are also continuing to work on improving our understanding of climate change. Paper was recently published related to winter precipitation, PVA, but more studies, more research is in the works that will help inform the climate change questions. So those are some important things that are ongoing that will inform future questions about delisting. And I think that is about all I have.
Right. Thank you, Scott, for that information, and to all of our presenters today. Certainly great information to share, and those updates are excellent to hear about. So we are at the second question and answer session in our agenda. Come in while folks were giving updates, but if you've been holding back a question, now's the time to type it in. And Bill, I'm going to throw it back to you to help moderate.
The first question is from, excuse me, I'm sorry. The first question is from Jim Bull, who asks, is it anticipated that sometime in the future, that meetings would be open to the public as they were with the recovery team? And I'm going to throw that question to Abby and Katie.
Okay, thanks, Bill, and thank you, Jim, for the question. The answer to that question is yes, absolutely. That's one of the reasons for announcing the March 15th, 2017 gathering. We see that as being open to anyone who is interested and wants to come and engage. So that's definitely a target on our calendar to be open to the public. And there will be some work between now and then. The steering committee will continue to meet. We've been meeting on monthly calls to kind of work through some of those behind-the-scenes details and to get the structure up and running. I think there's consensus within the steering committee to sort of let that planning and structure marinate a little bit and shift focus to those subcommittees, which will be recruiting folks and working through their priorities. And certainly we want to communicate to the public out of those subcommittee meetings and what the steering committee is doing, but really our focus is on March 15th, 2017 to bring everybody back together and open it back up. And Katie, if you have anything to add, please do that.
No, Abby, thank you. You hit on everything I would have said, so that was perfect.
I have a personal question for Pat Ryan. Is there any idea why there are fewer cowbirds in the landscape?
Just unmuted you here. I don't have a good answer for that. We've theorized that maybe some things are going on in the south in their wintering range with depredation problems in some agriculture fields, but that's as far as I know. Does anybody else have anything to add to it?
So it would appear that there are fewer cowbirds, the cowbird population is smaller across North America or Eastern North America?
Again, if anybody else has something to say about that.
Yeah, Bill, I would look at, the first thing I would do, Bill, is take a look at like the long-term breeding bird survey trends or any of the monitoring programs that detect brown-headed cowbirds, and to see, are we detecting them in great enough numbers where we can note whether there's a decline, and is it, sub-regional, is it regional in scope, is it eastern U.S.? So that might be something that we ask our breeding season subcommittee to look at as part of as part of their work, and I think Keith was getting ready to jump in. So Keith, take it away.
You said exactly what I was going to say. So I was going to refer to the Michigan and the Midwest level breeding bird survey data, which, not having that in front of me, I think indicates a long-term declining trend, significant long-term declining trend.
Yeah, this is Chris Mensing down in East Lansing, and Keith is right. There is a long-term regional trend in the Great Lakes region of declining cowbird numbers through breeding bird survey routes. We've got a lot of other anecdotal evidence. I know Nathan, the work that he's been doing the last few years, in the cowbird trapped areas, we're finding fewer cowbirds than what we remember in the past. You know, it's anecdotal, but it just doesn't seem like there's that many cowbirds up there. The thing that really is kind of odd, though, is all these trends are just declines. And if you remember from the graph that Pat put up there, we had a pretty significant drop in our catch rate starting in about 2011, 2012. And it's remained at fairly low levels since then. So what you see in our catch rate for cowbirds, if you start, looking back in the 70s and 80s, was a decline till now, but really we had fairly stable numbers up through, even the 2000s. But starting around 2012, we had just a drop in our catch rate. And that's where, I've talked with Pat Ryan and we've kind of discussed, was there some larger scale depredation efforts that increased during that same time period in the Arkansas, Mississippi area of these agricultural depredations of cowbirds. And we're just not sure if that is just, a coincidence or if there's some kind of correlation. So, we do have fewer cowbirds on there now, and is this a short downturn? And we may see an uptick in the future, and that's why it's important with what Nathan is proposing of continued monitoring as we start looking at changes to the cowbird program that we implement based on new models and new thinking, that we can start detecting changes in the cowbird population. So long stories, we don't know for sure, but it appears that we have a lot fewer cowbirds.
Thank you, Chris. Here's another question from Jim Bull.
I just had one more comment to add to that. Sorry to interrupt, Bill. For some reason, I remember from one of the previous meetings that somebody in Wisconsin was looking at tying breeding bird survey of cowbirds to cowbird trapping rates or something like that. Chris, does that ring a bell? Or am I?
Yeah, no, you're right, Nathan. So Deanne Donnerwright and some of her folks at the research station in Rhinelander were looking at our past cowbird spatial, our cowbird trap spatial design and catch rates and forest cover, and trying to get some analysis of how effective these traps were from like a desktop analysis. They had to take a pause on that, and I just got an email from her last week that she's got some people available to start working on that again, and so I need to get back in touch with her to start looking at that again, and especially with the data you have now, Nathan, over the last couple of years of tying it together. So not only what we see on the desktop, but with what you were seeing on the ground, to look at that as well.
And Anna from Wisconsin mentioned of the 15 nests they examined in Wisconsin, a third of them were parasitized. So still pretty significant, parasitism rate in Wisconsin.
Thank you, Keith. One more question from Jim Bull, and this would go out to the employees of the Michigan DNR. And I can understand if you may not want to answer this, if you wish to dodge it. How are we reacting to the bill introduced by Senator Casperson to prohibit work on non-game species, with most funding the state has?
Dan?
I need time to think. No. So I would say that right now that's our executive staff are addressing that along with our legislative liaison, and they have and work with staff as necessary to address, I assume we're talking about Senate Bill 39, but that is being addressed by the DNR executive staff.
I don't see any more questions. If anybody has any last questions, feel free to type them in right now. Otherwise, we'll move on.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for the questions that you did put up, and of course, if we move to the next slide.
And I think Jim's point is that the recovery team has written letters in the past, either in support of or in opposition to various legislative activities. So I think that was the intent of the question.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean that's something that I think the conservation team within our structure needs to talk about how we'll that if the role is right, if we need to reach out to people, and obviously taking guidance from our agency partners on that is going to be really critical and key. So it's a great question, Jim, and brings up something that we haven't really talked about within the steering committee or looking at the structure of the conservation team. So thank you. So we're going to move to the next.
I was just going to add, Nick added something real quick. Nick asked about the brown-headed cowbirds. That in Wisconsin, we found a lot lower levels of parasitism in our northern counties, and a lot fewer, apparently, brown-headed cowbirds around. We just don't see hardly any. So just another little anecdote on the cowbird topic.
Great, thank you, David. So moving from our question and answer slide to our next slide, you'll see again that list of and all of their contact information. So, once this webinar is turned off, certainly we don't expect that all questions will just go away. So if you have more questions, and anything specific to what folks talked about today, you have that contact information. I can also be available to receive questions and then filter them out as appropriate. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. As I said a little earlier, the steering committee, so looking at wrapping up on our agenda in terms of what's going to sort of happen out of this webinar. The steering committee will continue to kind of work through those structural and governance decision-making details through monthly conference calls, which is what has been our process to date. And again, those subcommittees are going to get up and working and meeting, and so we're looking to balance subcommittee meetings so we're not, stretching people too thin. And everyone has their eyes set on March 15th, 2017 to communicate back out again, face-to-face, and have some networking and some sessions, and to provide more opportunity for engagement. In terms of a follow-up communication from this webinar, you will receive something via email that will contain the link to download and view the webinar, as we're recording it, as I mentioned earlier, and some maybe review of the questions that were answered and some capturing of that additional information, particularly on the Cowbird front, that was provided for us today. We are communicating primarily by email right now. I do know of a few folks who are not on email, and I know how to get in touch with them. If there are people participating today who get an email directly from the conservation team who wants to be on that mailing list, please email me your name and email address, and I can get that added to our mailing list. And we can wrap you in that way. And then again, stay tuned for updates on that March 15th, 2017 event. We're all very excited for that and what that'll kind of look like come March. So the final piece is that we will be sending out a very short survey, 5 or 6 questions to people who participated today, just asking for a little bit of feedback on this communication tool, this webinar, whether you thought it was valuable, whether you'd like to see more. because we do want to keep people plugged in, and we do want to keep communicating out information on how this conservation team is developing, how people can get engaged and plugged in. And so having feedback from you folks who participate is really valuable for that process. Next slide. So I think that should do it for us today. And on behalf of the Conservation Team Steering Committee, I certainly thank everybody who took the time to participate today, for your interest, for your questions. There's a lot going on, a lot of great work for Kirtland's Warbler continuing to move forward, and we're excited to share. So if you need to.
Thank you, Abby. Thanks, everyone. Great job today.
Thank you.